How to Blow Up a Pipeline by Andreas Malm. This book, eye-opening, life-changing. I genuinely was like, oh, okay, this makes sense to me. I had these ideas, I had these thoughts, and it made sense through this. I just recommend this book straight up. I recommend you go out and read this book, especially if you're someone who is a climate activist or just someone who is an activist in general. Pick this up. I mean it. In the description down below, you'll have links to pick up the book from there or get it from your local library. Honestly, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I get it. I get it. I get it. Now, this video isn't going to be me giving you a call to arms to go out and do what it says on the cover of this book, because to be honest, this book isn't that. It's not necessarily a call to arms for direct action that will be classified maybe as violent by certain people, but it's actually a study of the ideas behind it and a study of why perhaps non-violent activism thus far hasn't worked, and why, you know, maybe the things they tell you about non-violent activism being the only way aren't necessarily true. And it genuinely is broken down really well, and it does actually tell you about the potential importance of supposedly violent activism. So we'll go into it. The book is broken down into 3 interlinking essays plus a preface and a note section. I'll give you the titles of the essays. The first one is Learning from Past Struggles. The second is Breaking the Spell. And the third is Fighting Despair. And I'll basically break this video down into me talking about each of these essays. Again, I'm not Malm. I cannot really put across how well written the ideas are and how interesting the ideas are. So me telling you this, me kind of breaking them down, doesn't mean you shouldn't go out and pick up this book. If you can get a copy of this book, again, like I said, from your local library, highly recommend it. Number 1, Learning from Past Struggles. This essay is basically telling you the past struggles that we've as a society have gone through and how people dealt with them both non-violently and violently, and the misconceptions about these struggles. For example, he talks about the civil rights movement, he talks about Martin Luther King in particular, and this is something you know, if you are kind of in the left-wing space, people will generally, you know, put across Martin Luther King as this only believing in peace. He thinks violence is the worst thing ever. Like violent resistance is the worst thing ever. That is a sanitized, whitewashed version of Martin Luther King that has been put forward. Even after many of the marches towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King would have guns around the house to protect him. I remember a story from a journalist, if I can find the quote, I'll put it here, but the journalist was basically in Martin Luther King's house. He sits down and he realizes he's sitting on a gun, and Martin Luther King was like, sorry, I need that around the house for protection. Martin Luther King famously quoted about how riots were something that were like a legitimate expression of people's need, a legitimate way of protesting against power, protesting against the people oppressing them, the people on top. Martin Luther King also whitewashed away from his left-wing socialist ideas that, you know, oftentimes when, you know, it's Martin Luther King Day, never mentioned because Martin Luther King is kind of put forth as this peaceful advocate for civil rights. He is the goal. This, at least, spectre of Martin Luther King is, and it strips away all the layers of Martin Luther King. We also, Malm talks about Nelson Mandela. The same thing was done to Mandela, where he is basically portrayed as this man went to prison, he wrote his letters, he marched sometimes, you know, just stripping away all the stuff. But the violent wing of the ANC, the violent wing of the anti-apartheid campaign, was Nelson Mandela's brainchild. He was the one, after the Sharpeville massacre, was like, we have to step things up. We can't just be standing there and watching our people be massacred by the apartheid regime. We need to have a militant wing, and the militant wing of the ANC was formed due to Mandela, and the militant wing was an important part of the liberation movement against the apartheid regime. And Malm puts across this very important, point that a lot of these, what are going to be considered fringe, more violent aspects of a movement, actually move people to working with the less violent wings of it. If you see the violence of, this is my own analysis, the violence of the Troubles, that violence forced people to have to come together and negotiate the Good Friday Agreement and bring an end to the Troubles. Does that mean it's perfect? No. Obviously in the UK, as of me recording, there was an inquest going into a very serious bombing during the Troubles. And clearly, you want to avoid the violence. And Malm is also that's one of the reasons the climate activists are trying to stay away from violence, because violence can have just bad consequences and lead to people who are unrelated to what's going on being harmed more so than the people who are responsible. And ultimately the people responsible are the fossil capitalists and the politicians that work alongside the fossil capitalists. It's such an interesting point. And he also looks at the various the big climate activists, I'll put the names here, who advocate for pacifist activism, and kind of how they have misinterpreted past activism and how they kind of put down violent resistance. He does make reference to how these people put down the Palestinian resistance against the Israeli occupation, saying they should have never resorted to the stones or the petrol bombs during the intifadas, when you and I know that violent armed resistance is a legitimate means of resisting your oppressor. And the Palestinian people, much like the South Africans during apartheid, have the right to armed resistance against their oppressors. They have the right to armed resistance against the Israeli occupation. And much it's more difficult for people to understand that climate change is an oppressive thing. Climate change is going to destroy the lives of people predominantly in the global south, but it will also affect us in the global north. People in the global south are going to be devastated. They're already being devastated by the droughts, the forest fires, the hurricanes, the flooding, completely destroying just people's homes and livelihoods entirely. That will lead to breakouts of war. That will lead to climate refugees. And the global north is separated from that, but the global north are going to be impacted. You're seeing this in the United States. The devastating hurricanes we saw around the election season, the wildfires that have been destroying parts of Los Angeles area in California, the flooding, the snow. These things are all violently dangerous. Even here in the UK, we're seeing violent storms. It's all due to climate change. And the global north is now starting to feel those effects. This book was written about 3-4 years ago, but now we are seeing it impacting the global north so much more. And it kind of comes to a point where climate activists need to be do we actually need to step things up? And that's kind of the aspect of the first essay, kind of looking at past struggles, looking at how people have struggled in the past, stripping away this whitewashed nature of these struggles and how people have tried to present them to prevent the idea of violent activism coming forward. And again, Malm does, preface it, and so will I, violent resistance maybe shouldn't be the first thing you do. The first thing you do shouldn't be, I'm going to pick up a gun or I'm going to go a pipeline. But when all else fails, is this not the step to take forward to force some change? The second essay, Breaking the Spell, really goes more into that idea of, breaking the illusions we have over what is deemed violent resistance, and, you know, sort of the problems people have had in going about it, or the problem with people trying to completely abstain from it. And Malm looks at different things. So he looks at the idea that is, you know, the system of fossil capitalism, not violent in itself? Is the killing of people due to the effects of climate change not of violence enacted onto the people itself? Would you not agree? I personally do. And he's also talking about kind of the myths that are built up around, you know, violent resistance. So, for example, you know, people like XR, he gives as an example, 2019, they had these big protests in London. I don't know if you remember. 2019 seems like a millennium ago to me, but they shut down London multiple times. I think about 30,000 people came out for them. And, you know, their main thing is always the, like, we're going to be the pacifists, we're not going to do any fighting, we're going to be nice. And through doing that, you know, when they do something violent, it is not planned, and it is then, you know, blown up as a really bad thing. And to be honest, in this XR case, it actually was. Basically, a white guy from XR assaulted a black guy who was trying to get him off the train, the tube. He was standing on top of the tube, and he kicked him in the face. And XR's, you know, response was, it was self-defense, you know, we're not violent. And when these small acts of violence happen, when your entire thing is pacifism, it makes it even worse, because when these small acts of violence happen, it's because it's unplanned and it doesn't really fit the actual goal of a potentially violent revolution or a potentially violent direct action. You know, you'd actually want something that was more planned. For example, during the Iranian Revolution against the Shah, they were targeting, you know, fossil fuel things. Maybe it wasn't directly related to climate change, but there was a specific reason for why it was done. In this essay, he also posits the idea, when is it time to start using more violent direct action, if not now rather than later? You know, we've already, I think, hit 1.5 degrees of warming, something that was meant to be the goal of Paris that we should never ever hit. We should never hit 1.5. We've surpassed 1.5 as of time of recording. We're on our way of hitting 2. When will it be time to do it? Will it be when we hit 6? And he gives the idea, well, if we start blowing up pipelines when we hit 6 degrees, what's the point? Because the damage may be irreversible at that point. And that's actually something that is also referred to later on in the next essay, which we'll get more into. But he's also trying to break this idea that the idea of, oh, eventually we'll do it, isn't going to be conducive to the climate change, you know, revolution, to the climate change activism. Much like, you know, if you try and see a resistance group trying to resist oppression, you know, when you're doing things and you're still facing the repression, you know, do you wait until your people have been completely slaughtered before you decide, okay, maybe I should take up arms, maybe I should start doing some sabotage here? You know, you need to think, when is it the time to do it? And is the time, never always think the time to do it will always be later. Sometimes the time is now, or sooner rather than later. And also throughout this essay, he again is kind of tackling with the what counts as violence and what doesn't. Is bringing harm to people the line where you should never cross? Is property the line that should never be crossed? If we're looking at it from a Marxist analysis, which he also does, private property is a tool of the oppression of the people. And does that mean private property is fair game? Private property isn't a person, is it? Some people will believe that private property is an extension of personhood, but really, is it? Your private property isn't your personal property. The camera I'm looking at isn't my private property, it's my personal property. You know, private property is the thousands of buildings that these mega corporations own that are used to exploit the people. Private property is the, you know, the oil drilling machines that are used by these corporations to enrich themselves and oppress the people who live on that land. There's a difference, you know. My tripod is my personal property, it's not my private property. And part of this idea of breaking the spell is him trying to put across that obviously there's that line that you don't want to cross when you're doing this activism, but where is that line? And the groups need to determine that line and ensure, you know, if you're gonna cross it, you understand crossing it or where you're gonna go up to. And breaking the spell of you should never even get close to that line. Well, at this point we see, you know, this idea of drill baby drill being pushed in the United States. That's going to cause so much destruction and hurt so many lives. There are going to be so many people who live in places like Alaska who are going to lose everything, all of this ecology and stuff that the United States claims to be proud of. I mean, you look at the adverts for the visit the US, it's always this beautiful environment. That's all going to go, and that's going to have a negative impact on the people. The hurricane's going to come in, it's going to kill people, and where is their line and where is your line? And you need to break the spell of you should never reach anywhere near their line. But come on, you know, you're going to be labeled a domestic terrorist for doing this, but is that terrorism when your goal isn't the mass oppression of people, isn't the, you know, trying to scare fear into the masses, but to actually tell the corporations and the politicians that there is a line that you cannot cross, and then maybe force them into negotiating with the more pacifist groups. And I can't end the section without talking about Ende Gelände, the movement in Eastern Germany where people are basically trying to stop coal fields being used. I believe since this book was written there has been some updates. I'll put them here if I can find them. But Ende Gelände kind of is portrayed as this violence against fossil capital, and he goes into this more in the next essay, but, you know, is breaking fences and stopping coal drilling really violence compared to the deaths wrought upon people by these companies that the fossil capitalists bring upon people? And again, I don't even think he's really touching on the actual, like, obvious oppression that fossil capitalists put upon people. Like, if you, this is unrelated to the book, but he mentions it, but I think it's because it came out before this happened, but like the XL pipeline in the US, the cops were out there physically brutalizing people for the interests of fossil capital. They were shooting them with rubber bullets, they were throwing tear gas, they were hitting them with their batons, they were spraying them with water cannons. That is literal violence for people who were at worst like messing up with construction equipment. And the messing up with construction equipment was deemed the violence, whereas the oppression of the state was deemed normal. The oppression of the fossil capitalists on behalf of the state, or at least the state on behalf of the fossil capitalists, was not deemed as the violence. And you need to break that spell of why are we accepting the state and the fossil capitalists doing it, but when the people try to resist it or fight back, it is not something we should do. We should be better than them. And the final chapter, Fighting Despair, and this one I just read this morning before recording this video, and genuinely, yes, so many people I am talking to are falling into this model of despair, that it is too late, there is no point. And we are, what, 4 years on from this book? This book was written before we hit 1.5. 1.5 means irreversible damage has been done. But even still, giving up and just, you know, being a climate fatalist, as Malm calls them, is not the way forward. That is giving into the system, giving into what the oppressive classes want you to do. You know, he quotes Granton as saying, "It ends in disaster no matter what." And maybe it does end in disaster, but everything we do can help stop it ending in disaster. Sure, right now, maybe we've hit 1.5. Maybe we are going to hit 2. But what's the point in giving up so we end up hitting 6 or 8? Because there's no positive to be gained from giving up. You know, allowing us to have this unfettered fossil capitalism, allowing us to have this unfettered use of carbon producing things, allowing us to just, you know, sit by and, you know, maybe have the odd sit-in or the odd like protest against it. There will be no positive from that. Okay, maybe the protest you will see some positive from. Actually, that's fatalist thinking the protest will have no effect at all. But there is nothing from giving up. But if you are doing something, whether it be, you know, the pacifist route of going, you know, making, you know, taking less flights, driving less, using more public transport, being more sustainable in your living, you know, all of those switches, moving away from using anything that promotes fossil capitalism will help. You know, it will do something to start reversing the process. It will always be more than doing nothing. This is not a zero-sum game. It's not, you know, we fix it completely by doing stuff or there's no point at all. There will never be no point at all. And, you know, the climate fatalism just plays into what fossil capitalists want. But he does give a warning of the climate fatalism masked by violence. There are groups who have completely given up on humans. There are groups that want to basically do eco-fascism. You know, they want to completely destroy the society and the civilization we have built. They want to purge the earth of the people that are here so we're down to a manageable level. They never say how they are going to do this, because if they did, they would be exposing themselves as the fascists that they are, and that is simply climate fatalism hidden behind the violence. That's not something we want to do. We never want to purge the earth of people. There is genuinely enough resources for the billions we have right now, and probably the billions more in the future. But it is our overconsumption, it is our capitalism, it is the fossil capitalism that is forcing us to believe that there is not enough. Because when you have a section of the population whose entire goal is more, and they are a small percentage, but that small percentage makes up a lot, you know, like the 1% that has all the wealth. That, you know, that continued need for consumption will mean there isn't enough for everyone. And I'm sounding like a goddamn commie. Well, yeah, because this unfettered capitalism, this unfettered desire for more, whether it be burning more fossil fuels to make more money for Shell, for Exxon, for BP, whether it be producing more junk so Amazon makes more money, so, you know, I don't know, Shein or Gymshark or Nike make more money, when it's literally not needed for people to survive. And maybe we need to be doing things that show them that their unfettered capitalism will have dire consequences for them and not just for us. It makes me think about actually the massive fire that happened in Ghana's Kantamanto market, and I'm going to put a link down below for places you can go to donate to help these people. But these people were actually doing something to fight against the overconsumption that us in the West have. Whenever you know, throw out your clothes, sometimes even when you donate your clothes to charity, they end up being shipped to places like Ghana where it's just left there to rot, where us in the global north, in the West, You know, we can say, oh, we're doing so much, we're recycling, we're doing all this stuff. Well, it's not recycled, it's just pushed onto someone else. And these people in Cantamanto were trying to do something with this. They were trying to, you know, actually be climate conscious. They were taking this waste and trying to make their own clothes. This was an artisan market. There were people who were making clothes, who were making art out of this stuff that we forced onto them. They didn't ask for this. The shipping containers go there, they dump it and they leave. They didn't want this. And the fire has destroyed everything that they were doing to not only be sustainable for a climate reason, but also to sustain themselves. So that's why I'm going to put the link down below to how you can support the Cantamanto market. And I want to go back to something I said earlier. He really goes into how people who are trying to fight against climate change, even when they are being potentially violent, they are seen as bad and are, you know, discriminated against and demonized. Here in the UK, Just Stop Oil, they're not even really violent. You know, there'll be an inconvenience, but then it's not even violence in the way that Malm is suggesting. Or Endergalenda, people breaking the fences are seen as violent, are seen as terrorists. But these massive fossil fuel companies are pumping out CO2 at unimaginable rates. They are drilling already at unimaginable rates, and you have the world's biggest superpower as it stands trying to increase that for profit for these companies, and they are not seen as the violent ones. And Malm's call is, when do you actually either match them or you do things that are going to be considered violent, but are they really? Is deflating tires in SUVs really violence? Or is the violence the oppression of indigenous communities in South America for the building of pipes for US corporations? You know, is the storming of a coal field and breaking the fences really the violence? Or is it the state coming down on people with batons and water cannons to defend the interests of fossil capitalism? Which there is really the violence? And again, he does say, you know, do we need to actually blow up a pipeline? We might need to at some point, but if we're going to get to that, we need to raise up our efforts against these genuinely violent corporations, these genuinely violent states. You know, they will tell you otherwise, but all of these mega corporations, not even the ones just involved in climate change, I'm talking about Coca-Cola as well, they are all inflicting violence on people, and the climate change and just activism in general has mostly been us trying to be peaceful against them because we don't want to be associated with the violence that they deem to be negative, that media corporations that have links to these mega corporations deem to be bad, that the politicians that we have that are being paid by these mega corporations deem to be violence. And we don't want to face that because of the social reprisal, and you will face social reprisal if you do something like that. You look in the UK at how Just Stop Oil people are spoken about, how they are getting like 10, 15 years in jail for sitting in a road, whereas you have like these CEOs and billionaires who are like oppressing their workers, let alone people in the global south who are impacted by their mass consumerism, getting on their super yachts, guzzling even more fuel, and being just the ultimate like personification of everything wrong. All of these thoughts I'm having, and then not all of them are from Malm's book. This is just me, like, as someone who is far less educated as Malm, who knows far less about the climate change movement. All of these thoughts are the stuff that has been triggered from reading this book. And everything I've said that, you know, Malm brought up, there are probably things I'm missing out, even though I went through and I picked out what I wanted to talk about, and even the way I'm describing it, I can't put it into words as well as Malm. Obviously, he's been writing about this for decades. So please pick up this book, because yes, it's a call to action, but it's not a call to action that should make you scared of picking up this book, if you know what I mean. It is a discussion that he is having in there of where are the limits, what are the ways you should go about it, where should you start, what is the best route to go, what you shouldn't cross, what you should cross, what the foster capitalists are doing to oppress you and how you can fight against that, and you know why you should. It's you just think of all of these things, and I already knew climate change was, you know, important. I already knew how devastating climate change was. I mean, on my politics channel, I even made a video about it. But reading this book, even since making that video, so much more, I am just, yeah, that's it. I can't even just formulate it because of it's just triggered something in me. Like I can't say the word because I know YouTube will be like, oh, naughty, naughty. But it's like, you know, if you know what I'm trying to say. And so go pick this up. And also, obviously, he has a bibliography and notes in the back of other things you can go and read. There will be references to people who are actually, you know, maybe in South America, actually with the indigenous communities, an actual South American person writing about their struggle, or someone who is from Germany who is actually on the ground with Endergelände more so and their struggle, or he does often talk about Sweden as well. But, you know, there will be a bibliography for you to go off and read more and go further, and then also maybe will actually, you know, be the thing that gets you involved with climate activism. Doesn't necessarily need to be the title of this book that you're doing, but it can be, you know, just you getting involved. Yeah, I'm going to end the video there because I could just go on like that. Thank you for watching. Thank you to my members. I really appreciate you. I couldn't make these videos without your support. If you want to be a member, you can click the join button below this video, or on my channel. If you're interested, it's £2 a month. Thank you for watching, and I hope you read a great book today.